Hey, it's Drybear. Dragonflight Season 1 is behind us. It's locked up, case closed. So today we're going to look at the start of the season to the end of the season for the tank rankings of all specializations. If you haven't popped by my live stream or hit me a follow on the live stream yet, every time you put on fresh socks this week, I'm going to make sure there's a small puddle of water right in front of you so those fresh socks get just a little bit wet. Now let's start like we always do by looking back in time to see where these specializations stacked up previously. Unfortunately, I don't have the data for week 1 through 3 on tanks. I don't think we did it in week 1 for tanks, but I don't actually have that saved there. So here's where we are for week 4. I mean, that's still going to be 3 months of data difference from the start of the season to the end. And it lets you, I think it's a pretty good representation of where things were in general. Protection Warrior and Blood DK kind of fought for first, and then I think in the beginning, Protection Warrior was the clear winner, and things kind of shifted around. So let's look at this for the start of the season for Dragonflight Season 1. And you can see that there's some pretty easy standouts. Protection Warrior was the king and queen of the court. They brought all the utility, crazy damage reduction, absorption, defense, high mobility. They could kite if they needed to. They had insane, unstoppable damage. If they popped all their big cooldowns, put down Ravager, and spent all their high rage, they could top any tank in DPS output, and oftentimes they would end up beating out their DPS in high M+ keys with lots of cleave because they just had insane damage. Blood DK was doing great, a nice secondary pickup for Protection Warrior, a lot of healing, less damage reduction for big hits, but they had plenty of shielding. Anti-magic was great for them, and they ended up being a great pick all the way through. Vengeance, Brewmaster were about average for the start of the season, just slightly below Prot Warrior and Blood DK, but still very good. And then Protection Paladin and Guardian Druid at the very beginning of the season were down at the very bottom. They were both struggling super hard to bring into some comps, especially in Mythic Plus, and we had them kind of at the bottom there. So let's see how this changed to the end of Season 1. And boom, here we are, Season 1, final week, Dragonflight. Here is where the tanks stacked up. You can see there's actually less of a jarred setup. Like it is actually more smooth, but we still kind of have these blocks of data where, you know, there's 2 tanks that are pretty close in first, 2 tanks that are pretty close in the middle, and 2 tanks that are pretty close to being towards the bottom there. So some major things to talk about here. Obviously, Protection Warrior fell. They I think were the only tank that ended up getting nerfed. And if not nerfed more than once in Season 1, which kind of surprised me. I think Protection Warrior had the rap of being unstoppable, but they weren't that much further ahead of everyone. When you looked at the actual performance for the majority of the players, definitely you saw Protection Warrior as the only pickup for the first 5 weeks or so in the highest keys for Mythic Plus, and the first clears in all of Vault of the Incarnates was Protection Warrior. But we saw some nice replacements there. Towards the end of the season, we can see that Protection Warrior is actually now towards the bottom, but not crazy amounts. I think the nerfs definitely hurt them. There's definitely some big changes, some buffs that went for all of that. Or it's possible that people just kind of stopped playing their Protection Warrior towards the end because they realized that, you know, the numbers were done, everything's locked up. It's the last week. Maybe I'll just retire my Protection Warrior that I've been playing all season and put less time into it. So maybe less parses. Or maybe just kind of less of those being stacked up there. The next thing to talk about is Protection Paladin. So we talked about this in the DPS video and the healing video as well, but Paladin got some major spec tree and class tree reworks that had a major effect on the overall performance of Paladin. And I would say that the 2 biggest ones were Protection Paladin and Ret Paladin that benefited from it, to the point where it brought Protection Paladin way above everyone else. Not exactly true when it comes to raid. Protection Paladin still struggles a little bit in casual raid. They do excellent in Mythic raid, where they have good support, where people kind of fill in the gaps. And they can also spend their holy power on damage and stacking up their armor rather than kind of healing their off tank or healing people, because they don't have to waste those globals on Word of Glory, which is really nice for them. So very high performance across the board. The majority of their bar of the 3 categories here comes from Mythic Plus, where they are easily the best tank for the end of Season 1, and I don't see any reason why they wouldn't be the best tank going into the start of Season 2 as well. All those changes gave them way more options in damage output, a lot more flexibility in how they handle specifically their spec tree as well. A lot of single target damage, but they still also have the amazing kit. They had an amazing kit they started with season 1 with. They just didn't really have the way to access their talents in a way that made sense. And they also just, all their numbers were a little bit lower that kind of made it harder for them to perform. So now when they are buffed up and their tree is cleaned up and they can get access to things in a very fun and interesting ways, the utility that Paladin still has is already there. They have the best interrupts of any tank on this list, period. They have the melee interrupt, which all tanks have, but they also have their Avenger's Shield, which is a silence and interrupt on top of that. And then they can also use Divine Toll, which bounces around and does all of those. Very easy to interrupt a large group of enemies. If you're doing big pulls in Mythic Plus, they still have their immunities. They still have their Blessing of Protection for others. Blessing of Freedom in some cases can be useful. So they still have all that, which is really, really nice. And they have better cooldown management with things moving around in the tree. Vengeance Demon Hunter, not really changed much this whole season. They've been about 3rd or 4th, and they've been kind of bouncing around that spot. Not really anything major changed for them all season 1 long. They got some nice defense bonuses on just passive defense, which is pretty cool. They got some changes to the demon that spawns that chases them, which is nice because previously they had to use 2 glaives to kill it, which I always thought was silly. Now they can one-shot it, which is pretty fun. I like that aspect a lot more than the way it was before. And there wasn't any major changes to their talents. They're kind of where they were. So we'll see if anything shifts up going into Season 2, Week 1. I doubt it. Vengeance is good. They've always been good. They're not the best, but they're pretty damn close. Underneath Vengeance is another topic here, which is Brewmaster. They started about average at the beginning of the season. Then about halfway through, they got a major, mind-bogglingly good buff at the middle of the Season 1, which is it cut their Celestial Brew, their personal shield. They cut that cooldown down by like 30%. It was a huge change and made their tankiness significantly better, which means they could use it more liberally without having to save it for key moments, and they had it up more often. They also got their damage values reworked, specifically in AoE, but it ended up being a positive, net positive for Brewmaster. And a lot of the fast clears and high value clears of raids, you will see a Brewmaster because they do good damage and they're relatively self-sustaining, which means that the healers can do more raid healing and also do more damage to the boss. And also, if the Brewmaster's taking more damage and staying lower value and using their stagger better, they get stronger. So all of that kind of lends itself well to bringing to a full clear. Blood DK ended up dropping quite a bit this season. They did get some damage buffs towards the end, maybe like 75% of the way through. That was nice to see. And then they got a couple nerfs, which shocked me. I never really felt like Blood DK should have been nerfed at any point. I feel like they were fine. They had great healing, but they also suffer in the damage reduction department, which means if you have to take a big hit, they're one of the weaker ones to do so. They don't really have the same options. It's like, obviously, if you get 1 or 2 shot by something, your insane self-healing matters not because you're dead and on the floor. Whereas, someone that could absorb that properly, specifically physical damage for Blood DK, but someone that could absorb that or use damage reduction without the need of a healer external to stay alive, that was always a kind of a conundrum for me, but they ended up getting nerfed and they're kind of in the middle now. And then lastly is Guardian Druid, who honestly has been sitting in the last slot all season long, unchanged in that slot department, and it just hasn't gotten much better for them. I would say that they have gotten closer to the other tanks throughout the season, and if you have a good player playing Guardian, you can do all content, and they're actually exceptionally good. I think the major problem with Guardian Druid and why their overall performance in parses is lower is because they are probably one of the more unforgiving tanks that if you don't manage your cooldowns properly, you don't have Iron Fur at the right time, if you don't self-heal yourself properly, you don't manage your cooldown stacks in the right way, if you misalign those buttons and you don't have a cooldown when you need it, you're probably going to die, depending on what content you're doing. Whereas most tanks have they have more ways to manage that, and if they mess up their cooldowns, like for example, Vengeance Demon Hunter, a lot of their tankiness is passive, so that they don't have to, like if they miss, they don't have their transformation or something, it's usually not going to be a death sentence. It'll just kind of put more pressure on the healers, whereas with the Guardian Druid, if you're caught with your pants down, you're probably going to die. So that difference, I think, affects their parses overall. They got some pretty cool changes to a Maul build playstyle. They got the arcane damage beefed up a little bit, which was already the best thing about them. And they had some decent, some changes to their class trees that made everything a lot better, I would say, for Druids. But I still think that they are obviously the lowest performing tank. But the tanks are overall pretty close together in general. There's some standouts. There's always going to be some standouts, but that is where we're at with the tanks for the end of Season 1. So I'm excited. Let's see what Season 2 is all about. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.